Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As you begin to enter the room, I'll promote you to panelists so that you'll be able to open your camera if you'd like. We strongly encourage that you open your camera, hit ISGAP. We'd like to have an open conversation and see everybody that is with us. Thank you.
Hello. Am I not hearing people? I'm not hearing Charles. Charles, you there?
I'm here, but I can't see.
I hear you.
I hear you.
Good. Charles, do you want me to introduce you? You're going to do it yourself.
If you'd like to, that'd be great. I'd be honored.
I will do that then.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll be starting in just a minute.
Hello, Ellen. Hello, Charlie. Ellen, I was just with Erwin today. We just had a coffee.
Oh, how wonderful.
Yeah.
That's
Good to see you.
terrific. That's excellent. It's good to see you, and we'll see you on the 26th in our Jewish Federation in the Berkshires here.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we'll wait a few minutes. It would be great if everybody turns on their camera and kind of joins. We can see each other and kind of make a small virtual conversation.
Good morning. Welcome to breakfast.
The sun is setting in Jerusalem.
Oh, right. That's right. Has it been cool in Jerusalem, or has the weather been okay? Oh,
Today was beautiful. It was sunny and warm.
excellent. Excellent. I'm gonna get my water.
So wait a couple of more minutes. I think people are still logging in. So as you log in, we urge you to open your cameras.
Hi, Charles. It's great to see you.
Nice to see you. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Good. You're in
Been a long-
Miami? Nice to see you. Are you in Miami?
Yeah, of course.
Nice. I'll be there tomorrow, God willing.
I assume that's not Miami, Manitoba.
No.
Good.
Miami, Manitoba in January? I don't know. Doesn't
You
sound...
raise your butt.
No.
Okay.
It's great.
How come so few people are opening their cameras? Is it our technical issue or they're deciding not to open?
They're deciding not to open. So if
Okay.
you're in the attendee room, when I ask you to promote you to panelists, that's to allow you to open the cameras. So it would be really great if you could join us in the conversation, but we appreciate you being here regardless.
Hi, Isabella. Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Charles. Really good to see you.
Morning.
Yeah, nice
Good to see
you.
everyone.
How you doing?
Good.
Hi, William.
Hey.
Such enthusiasm.
I'm saving it for your introduction, Charles.
All right, cool. We need all the enthusiasm possible.
It's been a long week.
What's the time? 5 past. William, should we proceed?
Yeah, let's get started.
Okay,
So-
so while we start, please, Daphne will help you open your cameras and sort of join the audio visual virtual.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon. I'm Professor William Brenner. I am the Director of Academic Development for ISGAP. I know many of you. It's nice to see you. I'm also in Jerusalem, and it gives me a real great pleasure to be the one to introduce Charles today, and especially for this lecture series, which is creating a conceptual framework for the critical study of contemporary anti-Semitism. This lecture series then is not only just for a one-off kind of thing that we're doing today, but rather following really Charles's conceptual framework that he lays out for us today. Will be our future speakers will also be trying to think about ways in which we can address thinking about contemporary anti-Semitism. As Charles has said many times to many of us, though in other fields, there is a well-developed set of discourses in order to talk about problems, let's say racism, there still are not the kinds of methodological approaches, descriptions available for anti-Semitism. Of course, ISGAP and many of you here have been groundbreaking in doing those things as part of our group, and this is meant to really be a kind of continuing project that will continue hopefully through the Summer Institute and past that. Everybody knows Charles. We're thrilled that he's actually decided to give us this inaugural talk today. For those of you who don't know Charles, I'll tell you a little bit about him. Charles Small is the founding director and president of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. He is also the director of the ISGAP-Woolf Institute Fellowship Training Program in Critical Contemporary Anti-Semitism Studies at Woolf Institute, Cambridge. He was an academic visitor at St. Anthony's at Oxford, a Goldman Fellow at Harold Hartog School of Government and Policy, and a senior research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle East and African Studies. Charles also really created ISGAP Yesh Me'ayin, something from nothing. And we are all grateful for the framework which he's created for us to have these continued conversations. Also, Charles acts as a kind of really an ambassador for what ISGAP does and for what we represent across the world, in America, in the UK, and especially now recently in Dubai. And it's obvious just the extent to which ISGAP is making such a huge impact today. Charles is going to be speaking about I'm going to make sure I get the title correct. Is it neoliberalism or new liberalism, Charles? Neoliberalism, anti-Semitism, and education. So, Charles, we give it over to you.
Okay, thank you, William. And William is, for those who don't know, is our director of academic development. He recently joined our team, and it's a great honor that William Bill's with us, and he brings a lot of intellectual gravitas to our efforts. Very important work that William does. So, and William will be speaking in the seminar series.
I think I'm speaking next week.
Cool.
So,
good. And I just had an Israeli moment. I got locked out of my apartment here in Jerusalem, and it's next to the president's house. So between the neighbors and the security guards of the president's house, they kind of opened the door and let me in about 10 minutes before I was scheduled to join you. So just the Israeli, I guess, social responsibility and neighborly goodwill still exists. It's a beautiful thing. So I'm here because of that. What I would like to do is I'm going to read briefly the description, which actually should be on our seminar series website, but I don't think it is. I'm going to read the description of what the seminar series is all about, and we have some wonderful speakers who will be coming and lecturing at the same time in the coming weeks. So the description is simple. It says, unlike scholarship on issues and processes pertaining to race, racism, and gendered identities, much of the scholarship on anti-Semitism is descriptive in nature, especially concerning its contemporary manifestations. This seminar series addresses the urgent need to create a conceptual interdisciplinary framework to analyze anti-Semitism or anti-Semitisms with an S in the context of socio-economic, political, cultural, and ideological processes, especially in the light of the impact of neoliberal globalization, which I'll explain in my presentation. There's a need to combine empirical and conceptual analysis of anti-Semitisms within an interdisciplinary framework in order to develop new tools of analysis. The contemporary condition is characterized by the crisis of modernity and processes of globalization, the impact of neoliberalism in the weakening of the state, the fragmentation of society, and the emergence of reactionary social movements on the extreme left, the extreme right, radical political Islam, and so the reluctance of Western intellectuals in a postmodern moment to critically engage these processes as it relates to anti-Semitisms and its impact on democratic principles and values. Not since the Shoah has the reemergence of anti-Semitic discourse and violence requires the development of a creative, interdisciplinary, critical approach to map, decode, and develop strategies to confront this oldest of hatreds. So it's a tall order. And actually this seminar series, I hope will be the beginning of a project within ISGAP. We'll have the seminar series, which I hope will result in an edited volume of the seminar series. And it's our hope that this summer in Cambridge or potentially in New York, we're going to invite a select group of professors of high-level scholars to sit in a workshop for a few weeks to try and develop or contribute to the development of a conceptual framework. And in a sense, for those of us who have done social theory and cultural studies and critical theory, we know when it comes to issues of race and racism, gendered identities, there is a conceptual framework. When we speak about racism, for example, in the sort of post-colonial era, or racism in the United States, if you have a significant liberal education, you know about the history of slavery, you know about the Middle Passage, you know about plantations, you know about the laws of Jim Crow, you know about segregation. We know that cities are segregated based on this history, based on the economic and political and cultural processes, let's say in the American social formation. We know that language reflects power in society. We know that notions of whiteness and blackness connotes the history of racism in the United States. When we study or look at issues of gendered identity, on sexism, we know that women in society don't have the same levels of attainment, or historically did not have the same levels of attainment as men. We know that our language is cluttered or consists of sexist discourse. So if you have a liberal education, there's a deep knowledge of the processes of race and racism and gendered identity and sexism. And I think in a sense, given, significant decades, 5-6 decades of work on academic scholarship, on racism, on race, on post-colonial theory, on gendered identities and sexism, that there is an awareness through our education in society on what is racism and what is sexism and how it impacts our daily lives, on society in general, where we live, where we work, what our wages are, what our opportunities are, how these issues affect, say, first world countries, if I may use that kind of outdated term, or countries in the core of the economy, and societies on the periphery of this sort of global economy. So there's this sort of, I think, awareness in our education system and in public discourse and policy around the world. And this is a good development, although of course, racism and sexism and homophobia and other issues are unfortunately still with us today, and in some sense, perhaps being even exacerbated in recent years compared to the progress that was made. You can make the argument that maybe things are slipping backwards on these issues. But my assertion, I think the assertion of some of my colleagues, is that when it comes to the study of anti-Semitism in the academy, and certainly in public and political discourse in the West, there isn't the same lexicon, there is not the same body of knowledge when it comes to understanding anti-Semitism or anti-Semitisms. And I can explain what I mean by anti-Semitisms as well. And in a sense, what is anti-Semitic incidences? What is anti-Semitism? Is critical analysis of Israeli policy or Israeli society, is that anti-Semitic? Where is the line, right? And we can see the line is drawn, there's the IRA definition, and there's, I think, a growing consensus because of the growth of anti-Semitism, that the demonization of Israel is in fact a form of anti-Semitism. But not too long ago, even in the circles of people studying anti-Semitism, that consensus really didn't exist. The IRA definition was the first definition that kind of connected the demonization of Israel or blaming Jewish people in the diaspora for Israeli policies or denying the rights of Jewish people self-determination was largely agreed through the IRA definition. It's a form of anti-Semitism. And I think people are slowly coming to the realization that yes, the demonization, the BDS movement is a manifestation of contemporary anti-Semitism. But this has been an intellectual struggle. I think that the tagline of ISGAP is that we're fighting anti-Semitism on the battlefield of ideas. And this idea that the demonization of Israel is a manifestation of anti-Semitism, and perhaps the most relevant form of anti-Semitism internationally today, which I'll speak to in a moment, has been a struggle to establish. And we're establishing it through scholarship and through discussion and debate. So there's this sort of emerging acceptance that yes, some of the criticism of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism. And that even when we started, we started to deal this when we were at Yale University. ISGAP was at Yale for 5 years, and we were helping to define issues of anti-Semitism. The consensus among scholars, liberal, even Jewish scholars, is that if we drew the connection between the demonization or the critique of Israel or Zionism as a manifestation of anti-Semitism, that inherently meant that those of us who were advocating that position were advocates, were political advocates, and we weren't true scholars, that we were branded as unworthy of being considered a scholar, but we were political hacks promoting the Zionist entity. And that was, I think, in 2006, 2007, a pervasive view in academia. But I think, fast forward 10, 12, 13 years, and given the upsurge of anti-Semitism from different sources, I think more people are realizing that there is a form of anti-Semitism as Israel, Zionism, and Jewish people that are being demonized. So even the definition of anti-Semitism is a source of contention and political arguments and debate. And I think, in a sense, this reality, particularly in academia, is very important, because I think to create a conceptual framework, to create a body of knowledge that can map and decode and shed light on issues of anti-Semitism is very important. Henri Bernard Levy always argues that the role of the intellectual is ultimately to shed light where there is darkness. And Judaism is all about shedding light where there's darkness. So there's a connection there. And I think, in a sense, as academics, in a way, has been at the forefront of, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, of the war against the Jewish people. There's a war against the Jewish people, and it's being waged on the battlefield of ideas. And this is perhaps one of the most important battlefields there is. That if Israel is an apartheid state, if Israel is a colonial racist entity, if Israel is a fascist entity, as more and more Middle East studies departments and the humanities and the social sciences at our best universities teach another generation of students, if that's the case, if Israel is an apartheid state, from a liberal international human rights perspective, that means that Israel does not have the right to exist. That if Israel is an apartheid state, from a liberal perspective, it would have to be dismantled. And that is what is at stake. And in the battlefield of ideas in academia, I would argue, because we don't have this sort of conceptual framework to understand anti-Semitism, to define it clearly, and then to map and decode it from an interdisciplinary conceptual framework with rich empirical analysis, if we cannot define it, we can't really argue against this intellectual onslaught, which is now perhaps the most dominant perspective when it comes to notions of Israel, Zionism, and notions of Jewish peoplehood. If we can't argue against this body of knowledge from a coherent interdisciplinary framework, I would argue we're lost. And if we lose the intellectual battle, ultimately this means that we lose the next generation. This means that we lose discourse and struggles to define policy which can identify anti-Semitism or anti-Semitisms and to combat it. So the intellectual battlefield is perhaps the most important battlefield, the results of which will not be, we won't have the results tomorrow or next week or next month. And perhaps this is a generational struggle, but it's a struggle that perhaps is the most important, because once government policies and military policies are based on this debate, the implications and the ramifications are profound. So this is our challenge, I think, to create a rich body of analysis that's interdisciplinary, that's rich in both empirical analysis combined with conceptual analysis. And, you know, just one note, at Yale University in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, the first white scholars identified that slavery and Jim Crow and segregation in the United States was actually a form of racism. The idea of racism as an area of study did not begin until these white historians at Yale in the late 50s and early 60s began to identify that racism and racial formations in the United States is relevant and worthy of analysis, and with this analysis to create policy, public policy, educational policy, urban policy that will deal with segregation and racism. The Chicago School of Social Theory, Robert Park, Lewis Wirth, the giants of American social sciences, refused to identify racism as something relevant in their analysis. They looked at segregation, assimilation, pluralism, but they did not engage the issue of racism. And it was W.E.B. Du Bois, who's now, you know, a celebrity 100 years after he wrote his important analysis. Du Bois couldn't get a proper job in the American Academy because he was dealing with issues of racism, and this was not an accepted notion in the academy. So in a sense, we can learn as scholars dealing with anti-Semitism that not too long ago, issues of race and racism was not part of the scholarship at our best universities in the Western world, but through struggles, through the struggle of leading intellectuals like Du Bois, who are marginalized or in historically colleges, eventually this was adopted by white scholars, and it was sort of brought into the mainstream of scholarship. And fortunately, we can look at issues of racism and racial integration, and there's certainly been significant progress and a deeper understanding among scholars and policymakers and public discourse about the issues. A long way to go for sure. If you look at American cities and some of the issues that in the United States and in other Western countries, there are serious problems of issues of racism and sexism, but we can argue there's greater awareness and progress. Hopefully the same could be true for understanding, mapping, decoding, and combating anti-Semitism. The group of scholars who deal with contemporary anti-Semitism, I would argue, have been significantly marginalized in the United States, in Canada, in Western Europe. Many of us who deal with these issues have all kinds of, I'd say, scars in our struggle. Some of us have lost our positions. Some of us don't get promoted. Some of us are not able to write for the top journals because we're dealing with an issue that is certainly not popular, and many of us have been kind of categorized as regressive in our work. So as we struggle and build, I think, beachheads in academia, there's more and more scholars beginning to deal with these issues. I'm sure we're making progress, and we have to continue in our efforts and to build networks and to support each other's work. And I think ISGAP and my colleagues at ISGAP and in other amazing institutions around the world are doing just that. All right, so that's sort of the intellectual background to studying contemporary anti-Semitism. So many of us know I would argue there's three types of anti-Semitisms, and I'm going to be very brief in defining them. There's sort of the religious form of anti-Semitism. Robert Wistrich, wrote about the unique aspects of anti-Semitism. He argued, as the other leading scholars, that anti-Semitism is different than other forms of hatreds in that it's inherently genocidal. So when the Christian form of anti-Semitism was dominant, when the dominant perspective or global view was through the lens of religion and through the church, we all know that the Jew was perceived as blinded by evil for not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah. And what made anti-Semitism genocidal, as Robert Wistrich argued and others, is that people believed not only was the Jew blinded by evil for not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah, but that the Jew was hindering global redemption. That until the Jew accepted the Messiah, world redemption was stalled and the Jew was blamed. So this kind of creates a genocidal element to the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. When the dominant lens shifted from religion to notions of nation, race, and ethnicity, Jews who lived in places for many generations were suddenly defined as a different ethnic group or racial group, a different nation. And unlike the Christian notion of anti-Semitism in the Jew, where the Jew could convert and become somewhat accepted by the dominant group or perspective or religion, when it comes to notions of race was something that was perceived in Western thought and science and theology and the humanities as something fixed. Von Herder, Hegel, all the leading philosophers of modernity believed in the sort of the inherent racial characteristics of groups. So even if a Jew mastered, Western languages or classical music or Latin and were integrated deeply into society, that they were still, regardless of their cultural assimilation, they were still ethnically and racially and nationally distinct. It was inherently biological. There was no possibility of converting. And as we know, the racist notion of anti-Semitism argue that the Jew, the racialized Jew, they weren't white, and they were poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. And unlike the time of Christianity where the Jew could convert, because of this sort of racialized distinction in Western thought and science, the Jew had to be eliminated to save the purity of the white Aryan race. And this form of racist anti-Semitism culminates in the Holocaust. So these are the two types of anti-Semitism. And now, sort of in this postmodern moment, I would argue that the most dominant form of the anti-Semitisms is now the attack on who Jews are as a people, right? That Jewish peoplehood is critiqued, Israel's critiqued, Zionism is critiqued. And there's this notion, especially among progressive intellectuals or postmodern intellectuals in the West, in the academy, and political Islamists on the other side of the equation, that only if Israel would disappear, then the world would be saved, right? As we've heard this many times, the inability to accept the self-determination of the Jewish people from the Islamist perspective, the Islamist anti-Semitism, and sort of this postmodern kind of radical leftist anti-Semitism, which is dominant in the academy. And, as a footnote to the three types of anti-Semitisms, we have now the emergence of radical reactionary movements. We have the extreme left, the extreme right, and political Islam. And we see also in the United States, the extreme right and the extreme left. We also see the rise of sort of, I'd say, white nationalist movements, sort of reactionary white supremacist movements, as well as we've seen with Kanye West and his support among the Black Hebrews, kind of more reactionary, Black nationalism in the United States, the Nation of Islam, Black nationalism, Kanye West and the Black Hebrews, argue that the Jews are really white and they've stolen the identity of the true Africans, and the Jews committed a genocide and we are the imposters and we took the African identity. And this, by the way, is gaining significant traction in the United States. So Black extremism and white extremism. So from a conceptual framework, from a scholarly perspective, why is this happening? Why is nationalism happening and populism occurring in the United States, in Europe, in Hungary? Why are states crumbling in the Middle East and parts of Africa? Why did political Islam emerge in the last several decades as a very powerful force in many Middle Eastern countries, in Southeast Asia and East Africa, and even in West Africa? Why are these sort of reactionary social movements emerging? I'm getting, sorry. So why are these reactionary social movements emerging? And in a sense, in the work that I do, I would argue that with neoliberalism, the social and economic and political conditions are such that the center, I keep getting phone calls, I don't know how to stop this. The center is under attack by the populism of the radical left, the radical right, and political Islam. So why is this occurring? And why is anti-Semitism, in a sense, really kind of exploding in different parts of the world? Why in 2023 is anti-Semitism such an issue throughout Europe and North America? And I'll remember as a footnote, when I started ISGAP, we started this around 2003, 2004. And we started to do work. Many people in the Jewish community thought that there was absolutely no need for a center on anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism was something essentially in the past, or maybe it was a problem, in the Middle East with the Palestinians and, some other radical Islamists, but in Europe and North America, it was not really an issue. But of course, today our communities throughout the diaspora are very concerned about what's happening in their societies. Why is this happening? And my argument is that there's some amazing work on contemporary anti-Semitism by scholars from different perspectives, different academic backgrounds, different political backgrounds, But I would argue that a lot of the work is descriptive and empirical, which is very important. But in my training, in my background, when I did my training for my doctorate in Oxford, we combined, there was a small group of us doing interdisciplinary analysis of different forms of identity and racism and sexism. I was focusing on racism and anti-Semitism, that we argued that we have to create a framework where we have rich empirical analysis of a social formation of a society, but also understanding the power dynamics of a society, the historical process, economic, social, and cultural processes, and processes surrounding identity. So, for example, how does Jewish identity feed into notions of anti-Semitism? You know, what is a Jewish person? Is a Jewish person racialized white or non-white? Is it a religious group? Who gets to define what a Jew is? And in a sense, Emmanuel Castells, who I think did great work on issues of understanding power structures in society and urbanism, I think he's a very important thinker, kind of a structural Gramscian Marxist, you know, if I may use these words in 2023. You know, trying to understand power in society. And he argued that the very fundamental capacity of a group to define themselves is the lowest level of power. The lowest, most basic level of power is the capacity to identify yourself as in a manner in which you want to. Okay? What's happening in the United States of America, for example, Jews are being defined by the other, which is remarkable. So in a sense, and this to me is staggering, I don't think the Jewish people in the diaspora have the capacity, particularly in the United States, to define themselves based on who we are. We are now being defined by people who are actually antagonistic to the Jewish people. So imagine, if you strip away all this sort of complex issues in academia and defining anti-Semitism and some of the stuff that I've just pointed to, 1 or 2 generations ago, the Jewish people were exterminated and displaced, those who were lucky to survive, displaced, at a level unprecedented in the history of humanity. And we were exterminated because we were defined as not being white and poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. Okay? Fast forward 1 or 2 generations, which in history is a second or 2, and now we're being defined as white. We're being defined as white, you know, sorry for what happened and welcome to the club. No, we are being defined as white as the quintessential racist, apartheid supporting Zionist fascists. And this is not from the streets of the white supremacists in middle America, or even from the ghettos of America where these sort of Black nationalists are emerging. This is being defined and articulated and taught and espoused by the leading intellectuals in the Western world. Edward Said, as Bill Kohlbrenner knows very well. Edward Said in the 1970s and 80s argued that the Palestinians were the Jews and the Jews were the Nazis. And furthermore, he even argued that he was the last Jewish intellectual and that he inherited he was the inheritor of the Frankfurt School of Thought, and he was the ultimate intellectual, where the Jewish scholars, he described them as scribes, were getting fat in the suburbs of America, that he was the last remaining Jewish intellectual. So speak about, you know, this is sort of Christian anti-Semitism, right? The inversion that, you know, the Christians are the chosen people, they have the new covenant, and we are the imposters, and we have to be converted or saved. Said essentially does this in kind of a postmodern, post-colonial, progressive moment. And this thing in which he said, 3 or 4 decades ago was absurd. What he said was absurd. But today, and this is the importance of fighting on the battlefield of idea, today, those absurd things, what he said 40 years ago, holds in our best universities. That the Palestinians are oppressed by the Israeli Nazis, and the Jews, who obviously have affinity and connection to Israel, Jews all over the world pray to Israel, culturally connected to Israel. Our families are in Israel, politically, culturally, historically, we are connected to Israel. So we are the white supremacists in the midst of these post-colonial progressive spaces of universities and the media of record. It's obscene. It's really obscene. So in a sense, if you take the words of Castells, the Jewish people do not have the capacity to define ourselves for who we are in the current discourse. So based on an analysis, a conceptual framework in which power is an essential part of understanding oppression, understanding racism, sexism, bigotries of all kinds, and certainly anti-Semitism, we have to give ourselves pause, particularly in the United States, the most powerful Jewish community in the diaspora, perhaps one of the most powerful Jewish communities ever. And yet, we don't have the capacity to define ourselves as Jewish people. We've been racialized based on, I guess, the American social formation and racialized identities, and defined in a way which strips the Jewish people of everything who we are as a people. Our values, our customs, our wisdoms, our traditions. We're white. End of story. And if you're white in these progressive spaces, you're essentially the enemy. And if you support the Zionist apartheid entity in these spaces, then you're the quintessential white supremacist. Absurd, but that's the reality. Neoliberalism, very briefly, and then I would like to open it up for a conversation. In the 1980s, there was this notion of structural adjustment. Under Reagan and Thatcher, the G7 at the time, the World Bank, the IMF, all came together to implement policies of neoliberalism. The belief was, in neoliberalism, was trickle-down economics, that the state was inhibiting the growth, the economic growth of the marketplace. And if the state was weakened, there would be more economic development, and with more economic development, there would be more democratic development in society. As the economy grows, democracy grows. This was the assumption. So in places like, I grew up in Canada. Canada had still has a strong, I guess, state intervention in the economy. The Canadian government and the provinces support the healthcare system, the education system. So for example, I went to McGill University. I paid about $120 a semester to go to a university that was the equivalent of any Ivy League school in the United States. The healthcare system, every citizen of the provinces had access to a good healthcare system. Canadians paid more taxes than Americans, but we had a strong, healthcare system, education system, all subsidized by the state. Under structural adjustment, the argument was we're getting Zoom bombed by Lev. Can you hear me?
Yep,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Okay. Lev said white lives matter. So there's hope for the Jews. That's good. So as the state was weakened, Lev. Daphne, could you block Lev?
Yeah, I'm gonna block him.
Our patience has its limits.
I think
Done.
Lev has been hacked.
Yeah, but he's back to attendee, so we're good. You can go on, Charles.
Okay, cool. So so there was this in the 1980s with structural adjustment. If the state was providing education, healthcare, housing, the argument was that the free market system couldn't penetrate certain areas of the economy and that economic development was thwarted. By limiting the state intervention in different sectors of the economy, it would free up the economy to the free market system. There'd be economic development and growth and more democracies. In countries like Egypt, for example, in third world countries, there wasn't the capacity to intervene in the economy like in Western Europe or North America or Canada. So the state would subsidize not higher education and a sophisticated healthcare system, but the state would give people subsidies for basic food, sugar, flour, basic education was provided to children that were young, basic programs in literacy. But as structural adjustment was introduced, countries, in order to be part of the global system of the global governance system and get support from the World Bank or the IMF or to deal with the G7 countries, structural adjustment, policies of structural adjustment had to be adopted. And if they weren't adopted, these countries were kind of marginalized and ostracized from major economic and political processes. So you see there was a strong drive to weaken the state in the hope that there'd be economic development and democratic development. But what happens when the state is weakened? We know that during the interwar period between World War I and World War II, the level of fragmentation and marginalization of people, of huge sectors of society in Europe and Germany and other places, was so great that this led to people being susceptible to populism, to the rise of Nazism and National Socialism and sort of reactionary movements. And we learned collectively after the Holocaust and the Second World War that we would never allow the social and political and economic conditions to exist where people became so desperate and also susceptible to reactionary populist movements in a way. So we provided healthcare, social assistance, welfare, housing, to create a safety net to allow citizens to enjoy basic rights. When this was removed, I would argue, and I argue in my work, with neoliberal globalization, you have, as the state withdraws, and this after the Second World War with modernity and the development of modernization, the state played a crucial role in the economic modernization of society. Remove the state, which was in some cases the glue that held societies together, you see a collapse and a weakening of society. So in countries like Sudan, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, you have societies failing. You have the emergence of reactionary populist movements there. As the crisis in the Middle East bleeds into Turkey and migration and refugees go from the Middle East into Turkey, and from Turkey, Erdogan, the supporter of the Brotherhood himself, turning the tap on and off of allowing migrants to go into Europe. You see the beginning in Hungary and other places of nationalism and populism wanting to stop the influx of these foreign Muslim refugees and migrants. So you have the rise of nationalism and racism. And I think the same as you can see the same happening in the United States. On the one hand, the inability of the state to provide basic security of a border, protecting the rights of its citizens. Yes, having a strong, robust refugee policy. If somebody shows up at a country's port of entry and claims refugee status, they're, according to international law, they're obligated to go through a process, an evaluation to see if they're truly a refugee. If they are, the state is obligated to take them in. If they're not considered a refugee, they could be turned back. You have now porous borders in the United States, people coming from South America and beyond into the United States. And you also see fragmentation in the United States, the rise of populism, white supremacy, Trump and some of his rhetoric, pandering to the sort of the white marginalized American citizen and American imagination. And in this, context, we also see the rise of the extreme left in certain spaces, and as I said, in universities and the media of record. And what's remarkable, in a way, in political Islam, which fuses a very narrow understanding of Islam with even, European anti-Semitism, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and even fascism. There's also a layer of Soviet propaganda and the old Soviet racism. Isabella's here. That also informs Arab nationalism. So anti-Semitism plays a key role in the foundational element of political Islam. It's the demonization of Israel as a key element of the radical left. And of course, the protocols and sort of Nazi, fascist, racist anti-Semitism is a part of the white supremacy and populism in Western Europe and in the United States. So all of these three reactionary social movements attacking the center uses anti-Semitism. And these, I would argue that these social movements are emerging because the center has been weakened by structural adjustment. The glue that held society together has been weakened. And what's fascinating with neoliberalism is that you have the neoliberals in the West, and you have the political Islamists around the world who want to destroy the state or weaken the state. They have something in common. So neoliberals and the political Islamists want to weaken or destroy the state. And also the radical left, the political Islamists also have something in common because they want to end Western hegemony and colonialism. And Israel and the Jews are all in the center of these reactionary forces. So I would say one more concept which I use in my work is time-space compression. That measures people's integration and levels of fragmentation in society. So in the contemporary context, this notion is that the more time and space you can cover, the more globalized you are. The more you're fixed in time and space, the more you're on the receiving end of neoliberal globalization. So you have large parts of society that are stuck in time and space, or on the receiving end of globalization, losing good working class jobs in industrial parts of our society, being replaced by high-tech people who are in the service industry, high-tech industry, who work at home or in fancy offices in the cities, where people in the suburbs, rural areas have been kind of left behind in this sort of neoliberal modernizing society. And those of us on the initiating side of the global economy cover more time and space. So middle-class intellectuals would travel once in a while overseas to go to a big conference. Today we travel or we do Zoom and we cover more time and space. Transnational corporations invest at based on milliseconds, invest and buy into different economies around the world. They're on the initiating side of globalization. So the notion of time-space compression, the work of David Harvey and others in this area, is a good tool to evaluate society and what's going on in terms of fragmentation. So in a way, I'll end here, but I think in a sense, I'm touching on the importance of understanding socio-economic, political, cultural processes from an interdisciplinary perspective, and a perspective that's rich in empirical analysis of societies, but also rich in social theory and philosophy, grounded in conceptual notions and ideas. And to evaluate processes in society, social movements, reactionary movements, and to understand why in this context that there is a reemergence of anti-Semitism. And this reemergence of anti-Semitism, if we understand it conceptually and as well as empirically, I think would point to something that's structural. This is going to be with us, I would argue, for quite a while, as society becomes more fragmented, as the attack on the center by more and more marginalized people seems to be expanding. Anti-Semitism in these ideologies need to be understood and unpacked. And I think those of us trying to map and decode anti-Semitism needs to do it in a conceptual framework and work together in understanding this. And I think I'll just end here. A wonderful model that I think I'm inspired by is the work that happened by the work that took place by Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall was a very important thinker in cultural studies and post-colonial studies. He was the director of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham, England, and he brought together a group of young scholars, and they dealt with these issues. And his students went on to become very influential thinkers on issues of race and racism and gendered identities, and really played a key role in changing scholarly discourse on these issues. And I think, in a way, hopefully our seminar is the beginning, and this workshop that we'll do in the summer is a beginning for scholars dealing with anti-Semitism to come together and to create a conceptual framework. And I should say, in the framework that the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies came up with, was dealing with race and class, there was tremendous disagreements. Some thought race was more important than class. Other people thought that class and economics is more important than race. And there were different subgroups in this school of thought. And I think that's healthy. That's wonderful to have these debates. But I think in the study of anti-Semitism, we're not even there. We do this descriptive analysis, which is important, but we're not really there as a community of intellectuals and scholars debating, what type of anti-Semitism is more important? How does power and a changing socioeconomic reality impact on anti-Semitism? How does globalization impact on anti-Semitism? What does neoliberalism do? And I think as a community of scholars, we have to really engage these issues, argue, debate, adopt different perspectives, but engage with each other and pursue truth and scholarship at the highest level. So I'm going to end there, and I'm happy to take comments and questions. I see Carrie, if you want to lead off, you're welcome.
Sure. Well, thank you for that trenchant and entirely cheerful overview. I wanted just to go back to the concept of a lexicon, developing a lexicon, which I find quite interesting. And I just wanted to say that if you combine Sharansky's 3Ds with the terms used in the word crimes issue of Israel studies, and with sort of compressed 1 or 2 word versions of the IRA definitions, if what one means by a lexicon is a vocabulary for the analysis of, then I think we have actually been moving in that direction. If, on the other hand, what you want is a vocabulary that is rigorously conceptually organized, then these terms, of course, operate on different registers. Delegitimization is different than racism, or Holocaust denial, which are much more specific terms. And for that, I don't have any idea how to do it. I mean, I think that's what would require getting people together, not just coming up with the terms for a vocabulary, but also figuring out how the terms can be organized, which I think is kind of an interesting challenge. But so I just offer that to you to see if you want to comment on it as a kind of further specification of the lexicon idea.
So I agree with you. Lexicon is important, and I agree we're moving towards that. I think defining anti-Semitism, the IRA definition, more and more scholars and social commentators I think acknowledging that the demonization of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism. So there is a development of a lexicon, and it's being accepted and adopted, and it's growing. And so I agree with you, and it's a good development. But here is something that I wanted to, as you were speaking, I remembered I recently gave a lecture in Los Angeles at a synagogue, and I was speaking about Judith Butler and Edward Said and the intellectuals who are at the forefront of anti-Semitic rhetoric and discourse. And there's a very educated person, a lawyer. She was also a teacher, a professor. And she was saying, like, don't these professors know that they're wrong? They're not, are they stupid? How can they be demonizing Israel when Israel's the only democracy? Like, what's going on? She couldn't believe it. And she couldn't believe that educated people would be anti-Semitic, right? So then, and we all had that belief. When I started going to McGill University as a kid, my father was, there were Jewish quotas at McGill during my father's generation. My father could not go to university. He had to go to a technical college and then went to work. And that was the story of the Jewish community of Quebec and many other communities in North America. When I went to McGill in the 1980s, the world was open to my Jewish friends and I, right? Everything was open. And anti-Semitism was a thing of the past. Today, we know that the universities are at the forefront. There's a war against the Jewish people being waged in academia. And it's shocking, in a sense. But if we had a framework of analysis like the study of racism and sexism, we know the history of universities have always been at the forefront of demonizing Jews. Think about it. Nazism was led in large part by intellectuals in the university, at the best universities. The scientists, the theologians, the social scientists, the philosophers defined Jew hatred. And that permeated the academy and went down into policy and military policy and resulted in the final solution. So if we put education into a framework of analysis in which scholars of anti-Semitism try to understand processes around anti-Semitism in the West, and I should not have been shocked that universities in 2023 are at the forefront of anti-Semitism in the Western world, because they were at the forefront always. I studied at Oxford, we're at Cambridge. Those were they were theological schools that were poisonous in terms of perceiving the Jew. So there's a whole legacy. And I think a conceptual framework and scholars engaged in this, we would know through our analysis that yes, education, symbols, ideas structured into Western thought and Western society are deeply rooted in anti-Semitism and Jew hatred, just like, but much more than race and gender. Ultimately, the Jew has been the quintessential other in the Western imagination for many, many centuries, maybe 2,000 years, right? So to create a framework where scholars are fluent and clear on these processes in our society and how they impact on the contemporary context. Said is essentially taking Christian anti-Semitism and the inversion to a postmodern, liberal, progressive language, but it's old stuff that's been repackaged. And I thank Bill and some other colleagues who've kind of unpacked what Said has done in scholarship, but this is deeply rooted in our society, right? So
thanks. It's all very helpful.
Thanks, Gary. Thank you. Holly, hello.
Hi, thank you.
Nice
I was so excited. It's nice to see you. It's nice to see everyone. I was so excited to hear you talk about Robert Park, because I am sitting in my office at Fisk University, which is in the Park Johnson building. Robert Park's last faculty post was here at Fisk. and alma mater of Du Bois. So I'm always excited when you bring in, I like to say my past colleagues, my ancestral colleagues. But my question has to do with developing the framework, which great presentation. I am excited to hear where this progresses about the conceptual framework. But I'm curious if you can go more into detail about a sustainability plan for creating the conceptual framework, especially in methods of application. And the reason I ask this is because you were talking about conceptual frameworks like Park and Du Bois when it comes to how we understand and process, discuss, analyze racism, how we teach about racism and elements of that. But quite quickly, at least here in the United States, it has completely gone on its head. Here in my state of Tennessee, for example, CRT or any discussion of race issues broadly, including discussion of the Holocaust, is limited in the state. It's limited in the state. Quite famously, some of you may have seen in the news last year when several school districts in Tennessee outlawed the teaching of mouse. Right. Okay. So this is the on the ground environment. My kids are all in public schools in Tennessee and have had no little issue before asking about the Holocaust or wanting to talk about those issues in the classroom or talk openly about racism, and their teachers saying, we can't talk about the slave trade like your mom lets you talk about at home. So what have you, I mean, I love this. I want this framework. I'm excited to see what comes from this work, but how do we sustain it moving forward? And especially how do we sustain this conceptual framework as we face continuous white supremacists, for example, everywhere? Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. So I would say before we sustain it, we have to create it. And I hope that this is the beginning of creating a framework. I think the seminar series is a first step. And I hope that the summer program will come together where we can sit for a few weeks in a small group of scholars and really engage this issue. I think bring experts from different disciplines to present to the scholars trying to create a conceptual framework, experts in globalization, experts on economic, social, and cultural processes, experts on identity, and present to the scholars creating this framework. And hopefully we can engage ideas and come up with something. But I think that this should be a work in progress in which we all work together and debate and discuss, and through that develop something. Because I don't think it exists. Once if we could achieve that, then we'll worry about sustaining it. Thanks, Holly. Christine, hello.
Yeah, hi. I just have two comments. One, in your discussion where you described anti-Semitism, etc., and then you went on to what I'd like you to clarify is, in the light of what you have said earlier on, how would you make up the definition of contemporary anti-Semitism? Because you used the term, then you went on into a whole. It is everything that you talked about in the context of the demonization of Israel, but you didn't sort of bring it back to or forward to the term contemporary anti-Semitism. So if you could just make a comment about that, and then I just want to have one sentence about lexicon and vocabulary. We live in a dynamic world, and particularly in the context of dynamic vocabularies. I mean, most ontologies on the web, they die off because they're not dynamic, and people have to keep working on them manually, and it's a real problem. So there are processes that can help that, but I just want to emphasize that vocabulary and fixing vocabulary, I don't think fix and vocabulary go together in our world today.
True. You raise good points, good questions. So contemporary anti-Semitism, I'm referring to, the issues that are confronting the Jewish people around the world. And I think contemporary anti-Semitism, the dominant form of contemporary anti-Semitism, I would argue, is the demonization of Jewish peoplehood in Israel. but it's also, there's a reemergence of right-wing racist anti-Semitism, left-wing, radical left-wing anti-Semitism, and political Islam. And I think, you know, as the center is being attacked, I think through structural adjustment and neoliberalism and the weakening of the state and the fragmenting of society, we have this emergence of social movements and protest movements that use anti-Semitism. And I think as scholars, we need to understand these processes. So that's what I refer to as contemporary, current anti-Semitism.
Would you add in that the issue of looking at the Israelis and Jews as a collective, right? Not just individuals anymore. Everyone's responsible for, you know, for being viewed as, you know, the new Nazis, or the Palestinians as the new Jews. Isn't that collective focus so much a part of what contemporary anti-Semitism is today?
For sure. I mean, the work of Joel Finkelstein, who'll be presenting in the seminar series.
Yeah.
Well, you know his work at NCRI. They show that in some social media spaces that Israel and apartheid have become basically synonymous.
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of terrifying. So
Thanks.
yeah. Thank you, Christine. Daniel Ben-Ami.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions because I'm genuinely a bit confused by some of the things you said. I mean, maybe it's because I'm an outsider, I'm a journalist rather than a scholar. But the first thing, you talked at the beginning about a kind of liberal consensus on racism in general. And if by that you mean that people are empirically aware of the historical abominations of slavery and segregation and so on, I can completely see that. But from what I can see as an outsider, there's a big divide in relation to racism in general and how it's understood. So you have the kind of classic liberal Martin Luther King colorblind approach to anti-Semitism, or sorry, to racism, and seeing that human beings are all morally equal. And then you have the kind of identity politics type approach, which focuses on equity rather than equality. So it seems to me that there is no liberal consensus, as you yourself talked about later on, and you're obviously aware of. There is a big divide, and it seems to me that wherever you stand in relation to that divide will probably lead you to drawing different conclusions in relation to anti-Semitism. And my second question was about populism, which you talked about a lot, but sitting here in Britain, I'm very aware that if you look at the Corbyn experience, and if you look at Momentum, which was a kind of core Corbynite group in the Labour Party, they were staunchly anti-populist. It's hard to think of a more anti-populist group. So not only were they for the European Union, which of course they're entitled to be, but they were staunchly calling for the referendum to leave the European Union to be reversed, the decision to be reversed. So on the one hand, it was a staunchly anti-populist group, but at the same time, it was very, very involved in Corbynite anti-Semitism. So how do you square that with your analysis?
How do I what, sorry?
How do you square that with your analysis, which focuses so much on populism, whereas in the British case, you have an anti-populist group, which is very closely associated with anti-Semitism?
Okay, so good question. So I was referring to a consensus. I think if people have a liberal education, I meant in the classical sense, and you go through a university in the West, Western Europe, North America, I think that you're given a good understanding of issues of race and racism, and I think gendered identity and sexism. I'm being very general, but there is a wealthy body of knowledge that's been produced for 4, 5, 6 decades on these issues, and I think if you're educated, you know a bit about racism and sexism and how it manifests in society in the contemporary context and historically. I think by and large people are literate. If I would go and have dinner with a group of people and start telling jokes that are racist or sexist, I think people would be appalled, right? And that comes from our education and our socialization. Maybe some marginalized groups would not be appalled, but if you're educated, it's not acceptable. And there's a I think a general understanding and knowledge of issues of race and its legacy and sexism and its legacy in society. That's what I mean. When it comes to contemporary anti-Semitism, I don't think there's that understanding or that knowledge. And that's what I was referring to. And I think with regard to Corbynism, I think I assume you know much more than I do. So forgive me for my comment. We have Lev here who knows a lot about Corbynism, and maybe I'll call on Lev next. But I think what Corbyn did, which was ingenious, is that, and I don't remember the mechanisms in great detail, but he enabled all sorts of people to enter into the Labour Party for in a very easy manner, for a fraction of the old fees, and that an influx of people into the Labour Party he masterfully used to go to power. So is that a form of populism? To me, as an outsider, it seems that potentially that was a sort of a populist move within the Labour Party that Corbyn used to gain power. What would you say to that, Daniel?
Well, I don't think that's how I see populism. I mean, in the British case, which I appreciate most people who are not from Britain, but the populists in general are understood to be the people who were for leaving the European Union because they wanted to, in their view, take back control, have national sovereignty. And the momentum and the Corbynists, I mean, you're right that there was this big influx into the Labour Party, but those people were very much for the European Union and against the referendum result. So wherever it seems to me that they were very clearly anti-populist by most definitions of populism. Wherever you stand on the European Union, it's not really relevant here, but by that definition, which in Britain was a kind of central definition, they were very clearly anti-populist, in my view.
Okay, fair enough. Lev, Lev wrote a book on this issue. Do you want to have a comment or a question?
Yeah, no, I don't want to comment on anything, actually. I do want to say that I'm sorry for the language, but what the fuck was that? And I think my email was spoofed. So please don't email me in at least, until I check this thing. And that's it. Please just WhatsApp me. Like, again, yeah. Okay, about Corbynism. Yeah, I wrote a book and a bunch of articles, but generally I think that I basically agree with Charles. It's putting a spin and another spin on the issue, on the topic, bringing Jews and thoughts by maybe Michel Foucault and bringing in the Palestinian case and human rights and so on. So and like whitewashing it all with stuff that is related to Israel, but it also is related to the Jewish people in general, and that's about it.
Okay. Thanks, Lev. Rob Katz, hello. Nice to see you.
Yes, I just wanted to say, I mean, it's not just curriculums that, explicitly promote, anti-Jewish, anti-Israel narratives. It's also curriculum that don't actually, that are just silent on it, that don't, and I'm speaking here about law schools, where you have an educational environment where, Jewish issues, anti-Semitism is simply not discussed. And so you have two things that happen there. Is you have a generation of, future lawyers who are, intellectually, morally disarmed by their institutions, as well as that same space being filled with, courses on, racism and so forth, that even when they don't explicitly say anything, hostile to Jews, simply by not including them, say, in narratives about the civil rights movement, or including every marginal group you can think of without Jews, it quietly reinforces what Charles is talking about.
Yeah, I guess we're trying to break the silence, if I can use that term in Israel. I don't know, but, another question. Okay, Jeff, nice to see you.
Thank you. Nice to see you. So I just have a few comments, and also as someone who spends less time in academia and more in media and politics. And what I come across is a number of challenges to exactly what you're proposing be done in the academic world. And here are a few of them that I'd just like to raise on a practical level. First is that, like it or not, there is a corporate voice that speaks for Jews around the world, whether we want it to or not, in the eyes of the world, and that is the government of Israel and the state of Israel. And the government of Israel and the state of Israel, as a messaging tactic for the last number of decades, certainly since Oslo, has been actually pushing a message with an eye, and I know because I talk to them all the time, with an eye towards what I think is delusionally believing that if only they speak the language of the left, the left will embrace them. And so they're doubling down on messages that continue to dig deeper into the idea of Jews as part of the oppressor class. And it's very hard to overcome that. So I think it's necessary to have these conversations, but it's also important to deal with communicating with them, but also recognizing that those messages are going out. They're going out because their argument, and they'll say it explicitly, is they're trying to woo progressives. And I think that's a fool's errand, but either way, we do have to contend with that. And the fact that there are government entities that will use, and by the way, the media in Israel, which is even more difficult to control, which will use languages or terms that are problematic. Number one. Number two, similarly, we have a Holocaust education problem, which I've written about, and maybe others have also, which is Holocaust education tends to, again, fall into lines that align with the dominant view, and what we see the results, which people now use the language of Holocaust education and Holocaust memorial education to attack Israel and Jews as Nazis, et cetera, because it runs away from the idea of the uniqueness, which you started with, Charles, of anti-Semitism, of what the Jewish experience. And the last relates to the point that just came up now, and this relates to the IRA definition. So I work with a lot of people who have been trying to legislate the IRA definition, and the cautionary note that I've sounded to them, which is that ultimately what's going to happen in America is what Corbyn tried to accomplish unsuccessfully so far in the UK, and we're seeing it inch closer in America. There are already leading Democratic politicians who are openly saying they have to change the IRA definition when it comes to the discussion of Israel, right? Why? Because, well, there's been a move to legislate this, and that will challenge many elements of what's now the dominant political party, and what's been now embraced by that party. And so the result is that we have the President's Conference, the Conference of Presidents, and elements there who are already siding with them. And I'll just end with this thought, which is I actually wrote something without saying it out loud, and somebody very involved, I don't mean to be shy, one of the people running the Conference of Presidents responded, "Jeff, with all respect, it's only 2 of our organizations that dissent from the IRA definition." The response is, number one, it's far more than that. It's probably half of them. But number two, that begs the question, which is my problem is not, the squad. It's not Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib being anti-Israel. It's that we have a major party that's willing to caucus with them while they're being overtly anti-Semitic. My problem is the Conference of Presidents saying, okay, well, 2 of our organizations are overtly anti-Semitic, and yet they remain our organizations. So we have an internal problem, which is, yes, it is necessary for there to be an academic framework, but I think we have an internal problem that those voices, which is to say the leading voices coming out of Israel and coming out of the largest diaspora community, seem to be misunderstanding the necessity to message and change that narrative. I just wanted to contribute that.
Yeah, no, Jeff, you make wonderful observations, and my only response would be, it'd be wonderful if we had this conceptual framework, and if we had young, brilliant scholars engaging this and trying to understand what's happening in the Jewish community. Is there an internalization of anti-Semitism? Is there an internalization of non-Jewish Jewish definitions of identity that's taking place in the US? Is our assimilation taking us away from Jewish values and placing, I don't know, some sort of racialized identity, which is sort of bankrupt in a way? I don't know.
No, I agree fully. I'm just saying those should be our target, should be the academic world's target audiences. It's not just the outsiders, it is the people themselves, or the corporate voices of Jews. They need to hear this most of all. And because academics tend to be on the front lines of this kind of thought, of the thought that's hostile to us, I'm just saying those are important audiences as you're considering the academics of this.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Charlie, and then Philip, and we only have like 5 more minutes.
I only want to make one comment, Charles. First of all, I enjoyed your comments very much. I think there's one thing missing, and there needs to be a greater.
Only one thing, it's good.
I apologize. Because I only have a minute or two anyway. I think, yesterday was Martin Luther King Day. Years ago, I remember when Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched with Martin Luther King. His greatest book was God in Search of Man. And the 2 greatest rabbis I grew up with was Rabbi Joshua Heschel and obviously Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. They represent a moral compass. We need a moral compass as part of this equation. And Natan Sharansky is a moral compass. You're a moral compass. There needs to be a moral definition to be complementary to the issues of markets and democracy. This moral, because racism, anti-Semitism needs to be addressed from a morality perspective as much as it is from a economic and social perspective. The morality perspective, what Abraham Joshua Heschel did 50 years ago was when he marched with Martin Luther King. He was a Holocaust survivor who basically saw the Black community as another Jewish community. What Jonathan Sacks did, he saw the world not only from a Jewish lens, he saw it from a humanity lens. Mm. We have to define anti-Semitism as a broader issue. You have said something remarkable that the last time you spoke, you said when they start with the Jews, they don't end with the Jews.
That was Elie Wiesel, yeah.
I know, because Elie Wiesel is my wife's cousin, so I understand that. So this is not about the Jews. Mm-hmm. We have to have a set of shared values. That's all I'm going to say. I have nothing else smart to say because I'm not an academic. I
agree with you. I agree with you profoundly, and I think part of the framework, and we've had discussions in Cambridge about this, is drawing on Jewish wisdom, on Jewish notions, on Jewish concepts,
Jewish chachma, Jewish chachma.
Yeah, who are we?
Right.
What's our sense of justice? What there's so much wisdom. We're very blessed as a people. We have so much knowledge at our fingertips, thousands of years of knowledge and wisdom, and we need to draw on it. And how can you fight anti-Semitism if you don't even know who you are?
Right? I agree. So I have to run, but I appreciate that very much. I enjoyed this. I will be on every one of your lectures. Thank you very much.
Thank you. But I think to develop a strategy to fight anti-Semitism, we have to draw on the wisdom and the Jewish concepts that we have. There's a lot of lessons of it, Hanukkah, we just passed Hanukkah. Beautiful lessons in understanding the struggle against anti-Semitism. We have a lot to draw on. Okay, Philip, I think the last question.
Oh, good.
And then I just wanted to say, Alan, you wanted my email address. It's charles.small@isgap.org. Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity. I spent my career as a problem solver, looking at anti-Semitism. I put together a presentation. You can't change anybody's mind without making them laugh first. So this is Christianity's Jewish roots with music and humor. I've done it at 6 churches, 4 Jewish organizations, Providence University College, and lately at St. Paul's College at
I
Roman
just want
Catholic.
to, I got to interrupt for a second. I don't know if this is going to cut off at 90 minutes. So if we're cut off, I'm sorry, but because I don't know if the Zoom session expires, my colleague
It's
just
not
wrote to me.
gonna cut off.
Okay, okay, good.
Oh,
So
good.
we have a couple of minutes. Okay.
Oh, good. So in a nutshell, I figured if you've got, 1.5, 2 billion Christians in this world, we got 15 million Jews in this world, we need an ally. So if getting the concept across that Jesus was a Jew, so were all the apostles. What are they teaching? Mainly Jewish values. Why are you dumping on Jewish people and Jesus' people? So upshot on that, I address this. I've got it sitting on a recorded that can be launched by Zoom as well. While I address the Christian world, I am not, it will not do too well in the political Islam venue, so to speak. However, I've got a bad habit of telling the truth. It's a partly entertainment, partly education, and a whole whack of history in less than an hour and a half.
You can send it to my colleague, please, Daphne. That'd be great.
90 minutes.
Philip, this is an interesting lecture today.
Yeah.
Philip, I'll
So
send you my email.
Okay.
So Philip, if you could, what happened to your email?
I'm
I'll send it to
spivakp,
you.
spivakp@gmail.com.
Okay.
All right.
I got written up in the free press. One question they were asking was, how do you get 4,000 years of Judaism in an hour and a half? To which I said, well, actually, it's from the beginning of time to today. I didn't want to leave anything out.
Cool, thank you. So on that note, maybe time is a social construction. We can talk about that next time. So next week at the same time, Bill Brenner will be speaking. I know it'll be a great lecture, so I hope you'll join us in this series. And thank you for taking the time to listen. Stay well.